When people today imagine the first days of Operation Barbarossa, they often picture Soviet soldiers surrendering in great numbers, overwhelmed by speed, shock, and confusion. And while it is true that millions were captured in the first months, the deeper and more human story is far more complex because mixed within those tragedies were moments of extraordinary resistance that stunned the Germans and revealed a truth they were not prepared to face, a truth that would change the entire direction of the war. The story of these first encounters is not simply about military collapse, but about how individual soldiers reacted when the world around them shattered without warning, and how some of them stood with a level of defiance that left even hardened German veterans speechless, especially at the Brest Fortress, where the fight began with a clarity and intensity that none of the attackers had expected. The German army crossed into Soviet territory before dawn on June 22, 1941, believing their victory would come quickly and effortlessly because their commanders had told them that the Soviet army was weak, disorganized, cowardly, and ready to collapse the moment German tanks appeared. And this confidence shaped everything, including how German officers planned the opening assault. Brest Fortress, a large defensive structure near the border, was expected to fall within hours. The Germans had maps, intelligence reports, and aerial photographs, and everything suggested that the Soviet soldiers inside were unprepared, half asleep, poorly commanded, and doomed. Yet when the first shells struck, when the fortress walls trembled under thousands of artillery rounds, something unexpected happened, something that would echo through German diaries for years afterward. Instead of collapsing, Soviet soldiers began to resist with a tenacity that seemed impossible under such circumstances. Buildings were destroyed, entire courtyards were burning, and communication lines were severed. Yet small groups of defenders continued fighting from the rubble, firing from windows that no longer existed, crawling through smoke-filled corridors, and rallying one another with a determination that the Germans did not believe the Soviets possessed. Among the earliest defenders were two Soviet border guards whose story became legendary because of how calmly and stubbornly they fought against overwhelming forces. These two men, whose names were not famous, did something so remarkable that even their enemies could not forget them. Because when a company of German motorcyclists stormed the area, expecting no resistance, the two guards opened fire with such precision and such fearlessness that the German soldiers were forced to stop, take cover, and rethink their approach. The idea that two men could delay an entire company sounded absurd to the German commanders, who later heard about it. But diaries written by German soldiers confirmed that this was precisely what happened, and what stunned them even more was not simply the gunfire, but the attitude of the defenders. Because when the two Soviet guards were finally surrounded, captured, and lined up for execution, the Germans expected to see the usual reactions of defeated men: fear, panic, pleading, but they saw none of it. Instead, they saw calm faces, steady breathing, even laughter. The kind of laughter that unsettled the execution squad, because it felt like the two men were not losing anything at all, but were instead winning something the Germans could not understand. A German soldier wrote in his diary that this moment gave him goosebumps and that he had never seen men accept death with such composure, not even among his own comrades, and he admitted that he and the others were shaken in a way they had never been shaken before. It made them question everything they had been told about the Soviet army, and for the first time they wondered whether this war would be as easy as their generals promised. That entry, preserved long after the war, has been studied by historians because it captures something essential about the early days of Barbarossa, something often overlooked when people focus only on the massive numbers of prisoners. And that is the fact that many Soviet soldiers chose death over surrender, and that their acts of resistance, even when they were small, had a psychological power far greater than their physical effect. Although millions of Soviet soldiers were indeed captured in those early months, the reasons for this mass surrender were not because they lacked courage, but because of how rapidly the German blitzkrieg advanced, how disastrously unprepared the Soviet command structure was, and how chaos spread across entire armies before they even understood what was happening. Radios did not work, orders contradicted one another, commanders were missing or dead, and whole divisions were cut off without food, ammunition, or transportation. In such conditions, surrender was not always a choice but an inevitability. Yet even alongside those scenes of collapse were other scenes in which Soviet soldiers fought with such endurance that German troops later said they had never encountered anything like it in their entire military careers. At Brest Fortress, resistance continued not for hours but for days, then for weeks, even though the Soviets inside had no supplies, no reinforcement, and no hope of relief. They fought in dark cellars, in collapsed tunnels, in destroyed barracks, and in hallways filled with smoke so thick it was impossible to see more than a few steps ahead. When water ran out, they crawled to the river under machine gun fire. When ammunition ran out, they used grenades, bayonets, fists, and anything that could be held in the hand. German soldiers became frustrated and then angry because they believed the fortress was already theirs and could not understand why the fighting continued inside walls that should have been silent. This confusion quickly turned into respect, grudging at first, then open, and it began to spread across the front as more German units encountered Soviet soldiers who refused to surrender even when completely isolated. One of the most defining characteristics of Soviet resistance in 1941 was the speed with which morale changed from confusion to determination. In the first hours, many soldiers were unaware that a full-scale invasion had begun because German bombers had destroyed communication lines, and some woke to explosions without knowing whether they were drills or accidents. Once they understood the situation, once they realized the scale of the attack, many found themselves surrounded before they had time to retreat. But where retreat was impossible, they fought with whatever they had. And even German diaries describe the shock of seeing Soviet soldiers charge tanks with rifles, bottle bombs, and sheer desperation. German propaganda films later tried to portray the Soviets as weak because so many surrendered. But privately, German officers told a different story, admitting that they had never fought an enemy so willing to endure such extreme suffering. This willingness was deeply rooted in Soviet culture, shaped by decades of hardship, famine, political repression, and forced labor. And when war came, those experiences forged a population capable of enduring things that many Germans considered beyond the limits of human endurance. The Germans expected an opponent similar to the French or the Poles, but what they found was an opponent capable of absorbing unimaginable losses without breaking completely. As the fighting continued through the summer and autumn of 1941, German soldiers began to realize that the spirit they saw in the two border guards at Brest was not an isolated case, but a recurring pattern across the entire front. And this discovery unsettled them because it contradicted everything their leaders had claimed. Instead of surrendering easily, Soviet units often fought until they were surrounded multiple times. And even after being surrounded, they continued fighting until they were physically incapable of resisting any longer. This was not the behavior of a weak army, but of an army caught off guard and then forced to adapt under the harshest possible conditions. German veterans later said that the Soviet habit of fighting from the ruins of villages, forests, factories, and fields made them extraordinarily difficult to defeat. Even after a position was considered captured, pocket resistance remained, snipers remained, small groups remained, and the Germans were constantly forced to clear areas multiple times, losing men in ways that felt senseless and exhausting. In their letters home, German soldiers often described the Soviet soldier as someone who simply refused to understand when he was defeated, someone who kept fighting long after common sense suggested giving up, someone whose endurance was so extreme that it became the most defining characteristic of the Eastern Front. This endurance deeply affected German morale. They had begun the invasion confident, thrilled, proud, certain of victory, but by autumn, many wrote that their nerves were fraying because the Soviets refused to collapse. Even when winter came and German units were freezing in unheated trenches, They saw Soviet soldiers continue fighting in temperatures that destroyed machinery and killed livestock. Their stubbornness, their ability to endure famine, exhaustion, cold, and grief became legendary among German troops, who increasingly spoke of the Russians not as ordinary soldiers, but as people shaped by a completely different relationship with suffering. This growing respect mixed with fear, because Germans realized they could never match the sheer emotional commitment Soviet soldiers brought to the battlefield. The Soviets were fighting for their homes, their families, their survival as a nation, and for many, surrender meant starvation or death in German camps. This meant they had nothing to lose by fighting until the last breath. German soldiers had no such motivation. They fought for victory, for pride, and for loyalty to their commanders. But they did not usually fight with the same sense of existential desperation, and this difference became more and more apparent as the war progressed. By late 1941, when the Germans neared Moscow and believed final victory was near, Soviet soldiers launched counterattacks so fierce that German troops reeled backward for the first time, completely stunned. The shock came not only from military losses, but from the realization that the Soviets had reserves they never expected, fresh troops ready to resist at the harshest moment of the year. The Germans suddenly understood that the war would not end quickly, that the early surrenders they had seen were misleading, that the true character of the Soviet army was only beginning to reveal itself. This shift in understanding began with moments like the defiance of the two guards at Brest. Their refusal to beg, their refusal to panic, their refusal to surrender, and their calm acceptance of death left a wound in the German perception of Soviet weakness, a wound that grew day by day as resistance increased across the entire front. Those two men were among the first to teach the Germans something they had not wanted to learn, something that changed the Eastern Front forever. The Soviets would not surrender easily, they would not collapse quickly, they would not stop fighting until the war reached every corner of the land. As the months passed and the Germans pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the pattern of resistance they encountered began to take on a character that was even more disturbing to them, because while they still captured many prisoners, the quality of the fighting in places where the Soviets chose to stand became more intense and more personal, and German units repeatedly found themselves surprised by sudden counterattacks launched by soldiers who had been starved, frozen, exhausted, and overwhelmed, yet somehow found the will to strike back. German reports documented how Soviet soldiers hid in trenches covered with snow, emerging at the last second with grenades in their hands and no concern for their own survival. And these acts, far from being isolated, became common enough that German infantrymen began to dread advancing through forests or ruined settlements where every shadow seemed to hold a man who was ready to die with his enemy in his arms. This created a psychological strain that the German high command had not anticipated. Their soldiers had entered the Soviet Union believing they would fight a short and decisive war, but instead they encountered an enemy who accepted unimaginable suffering as a normal part of existence. And the German diaries from this period show growing confusion about how to mentally process such resilience. Some wrote that the Russians seemed more like forces of nature than soldiers, as if cold, hunger, and bombardment simply did not break them the way those same experiences could break the best-trained European armies. Others said the Russians fought like men who believed they were already dead, and therefore had nothing left to fear. And while this description was overly dramatic, it captured an essential truth about how Soviet soldiers viewed the war. For them, survival was already uncertain, and many of them understood that surrender offered no safety either, because German propaganda had declared Slavs inferior and unworthy of humane treatment. And the killing squads known as Einsatzgruppen were murdering civilians and political officers across the newly occupied territories. This knowledge spread quickly through the ranks of Soviet troops, and it strengthened their resolve to avoid surrender at any cost, because they knew the enemy saw them not as prisoners, but as obstacles to be removed. In many ways, German brutality created the very resistance they feared most, because the more destruction they inflicted, the more determined the Soviet soldiers became to resist until the last moment. Even in the early months, when entire Soviet divisions were shattered beyond recognition, there were countless small units that refused to accept defeat. Groups of men cut off behind German lines who chose to continue fighting rather than surrender. Some became partisans almost immediately, slipping into forests and swamps and carrying out attacks that frustrated the German rear units. Others remained hidden in burned-out buildings and waited for moments to ambush German patrols or disrupt supply convoys. These small acts of resistance added up, creating constant tension for German soldiers who imagined that every village or wooded area could hide men prepared to strike unexpectedly. The Germans had never experienced warfare of this type on such a large scale, and it slowly wore down their confidence, even though they continued to advance militarily. But the story of Soviet resistance is not only about scattered groups or heroic individuals, it is also about how the Soviet state rapidly reorganized itself to sustain a war that was far more devastating than anything it had faced before. Stalin, stunned by the initial catastrophe, soon realized that the only way to prevent complete defeat was to hold the country together through sheer force of will and to mobilize every resource available. Factories were moved eastward, civilians were pushed into defensive work, and propaganda was used to instill a sense of national survival. This created an environment in which surrender became culturally unacceptable because it was equated with betrayal of the homeland and abandonment of one's people. Soviet soldiers absorbed this message instinctively, and their behavior on the battlefield reflected the belief that giving up was worse than dying. German soldiers noticed this shift during the battles around Smolensk, Kiev, and Vyazma, where even surrounded Soviet units continued fighting for days or weeks after their fate was sealed. German officers often wrote that they had never seen anything like it, because in other European campaigns, Poland, France, the Balkans, surrounded troops eventually surrendered to avoid pointless casualties. But in the Soviet Union, many soldiers refused to do so, forcing the Germans to spend enormous amounts of time and resources eliminating pockets of resistance that should have collapsed on their own. Every hour spent clearing these pockets slowed the advance and wore down the attackers. And the Germans observed that every day brought more defenders willing to fight with the same grim determination the two border guards had shown at Brest Fortress. This defiance grew even stronger when winter began to take hold, because the harsh climate favored the defenders. German troops, unprepared for the cold, struggled to keep their weapons functioning in sub-zero temperatures, while Soviet soldiers, many of whom had lived their entire lives in such conditions, adapted more easily. Their ability to survive and fight in the cold astonished German units that were losing men to frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion. German diaries mention watching Soviet soldiers run across snowdrifts with speed and confidence, while German men sank deeply into the snow with every step. These small observations reinforced the idea that the Soviets had a natural advantage in endurance, and that this would play a significant role in the battles ahead. One of the most influential moments occurred during the Battle of Moscow in late 1941, when the Soviets launched a counteroffensive that pushed back exhausted German units who had believed they were on the verge of capturing the city. The sudden appearance of fresh Soviet divisions, many wearing white camouflage and skiing through forests, shocked the Germans because they had assumed the Soviet Union was already defeated. This offensive demonstrated not just military strength, but psychological strength, because it showed the Germans that their enemy still had reserves of manpower and morale far greater than expected. German soldiers who had been confident that the war would end before winter now realized that they had underestimated the determination of the Soviets to keep fighting regardless of the conditions. The story of these early months is therefore not simply one of Soviet surrender or German victory, but one of resistance emerging from chaos, of resilience forming under immense pressure, and of a nation discovering that it had the ability to endure suffering on a level that shocked even its enemies. The two border guards who laughed in the face of execution, were not anomalies but early symbols of a larger truth that became visible to the Germans only gradually. And as more German soldiers encountered Soviet resistance, they began to understand that the Russians would not collapse the way Hitler had predicted. Many German veterans later reflected on this realization with surprise and humility. They spoke about how quickly their confidence disappeared once they faced opponents who did not respond to fear the way Europeans typically did. They wrote about how the Soviets seemed to accept death as a natural consequence of war, and how this acceptance made them incredibly difficult to break. Some German soldiers even admitted that after the first weeks of fighting, they began to dread encounters with Soviet troops more than any other army they had ever faced, because the Soviets fought with a sense of purpose that could not be shaken by setbacks or losses. The broader picture of the early war is therefore much more complex than the idea that the Soviets surrendered easily. It is true that millions were captured, but these captures often resulted from poor communication, encirclement, and logistical collapse rather than cowardice. At the same time, countless Soviet soldiers fought with extraordinary courage, refusing to surrender even when isolated and starving. The Germans saw both extremes and were forced to revise their understanding of the Soviet military as the war continued. By the end of 1941, the Germans realized that the Soviet Union was not going to collapse, and that the spirit shown by the two border guards at Brest was a preview of the kind of enemy they would face for the remainder of the war. In countless battles across forests, fields, swamps, villages, and cities, the Germans encountered Soviet soldiers who fought with a combination of desperation, patriotism, fear of German brutality, and personal determination to protect their homeland. And this combination formed a wall of resistance that grew stronger as the war progressed. In the end, the question of whether Soviet soldiers surrendered easily can only be answered by understanding the difference between strategic collapse and personal resolve. Armies can fall apart when command structures fail, when supply lines collapse, or when surprise attacks overwhelm entire units. But individual soldiers can still fight with courage, regardless of the situation around them, and the early stories of the Eastern Front show this clearly. Soviet soldiers displayed a level of individual bravery that astonished the Germans, and their refusal to surrender in countless situations became one of the defining features of the war. When historians look back on Operation Barbarossa, they see not only the largest invasion in history, but also one of the most dramatic examples of human resilience ever recorded. And the two men at Brest Fortress who laughed in the face of death stand as symbols of a spirit that would eventually turn the tide of the war. Their example spread across the Soviet Union, inspiring others to resist, and their story lived on in German diaries as a reminder that the Soviet people would not bow easily, no matter how severe the circumstances.